To say the COVID-19 pandemic had some devastating impacts on our economy would be, well, a bit of an understatement. We saw staggering job loss and unemployment numbers, businesses shutting their doors in many instances for good, and entire industries like the hospitality and leisure getting crushed, and we know the recovery from many of these is going to be slow. In fact, Mark Hoplamazian, president and CEO of Hyatt Hotels, said in a recent interview that, for his best guess, the hotel industry won't get back to even looking like what it did in 2019 with those numbers until 2023. But not every industry was crushed by the pandemic. This may be surprising, but the retail industry actually experienced sales growth that it hasn't seen in nearly 2 decades. What could this mean for retail property lending? Perhaps pent-up demand leading to unloading of capital by lenders. We are back with a brand new episode of Mission Control, the Bellwether Enterprise Podcast. I'm Ryan Dentscheff. This podcast episode is the first of a new series where we dive in and explore various topics and trends within the commercial real estate industry to be featured in our monthly newsletter, the BWE Insider. If you're interested in receiving this newsletter, which includes commercial real estate news and updates from industry experts, deal highlights, and more, please send an email to marketing@bwecap.com. According to the National Retail Federation, during its 2021 Economic Forecast Conference call with the media on February 24th, it reported that the retail industry sales grew by 6.7% year over year from 2019 to 2020. And in their projections, NRF Chief Economist Jack Kleinhans said that sales growth projections for 2021 are expected to increase yet again from anywhere between 6.5 to 8.2% to around $4.4 trillion in total retail spending.
We believe that there's a number of factors that have provided this optimism and healthy macroeconomic conditions. This is the second year of extraordinary savings. The wealth effect has taken place in terms of high stock valuations and home prices. So the consumer certainly has purchasing power and is willing to spend, and we believe that's going to be important.
The various government assistance efforts that have been implemented, such as the Payment Protection Program, Unemployment Boost, and now a third round of stimulus checks currently getting distributed to roughly 85% of American households, all play a role in consumer retail spending as well. So in this respect, Americans have been able to stay afloat, and many have actually been saving a lot during the pandemic. Vacations have been put on hold, people weren't able to go out to eat at restaurants or attend live concerts, theaters, and other various entertainment venues. This led to U.S. consumers saving in excess of $1.5 trillion during the pandemic.
Disposable personal income in terms of savings is 13.7%. And if you go back before the pandemic, it was 7.3 to 7.5. So purchasing power is there.
To offer some more insight on what's going on in the retail space, how retailers are adapting to the current state of the world, and what he sees coming in the near future, I recently interviewed the Vice President of Research Development and Industry Analysis for the National Retail Federation, Mark Matthews.
Honestly, if you go back to the beginning of the pandemic, I don't think anybody would have predicted this outcome. I certainly would not have predicted that 2020 would be the biggest year of retail sales growth we've seen in the last 20 years. And the reason that happened is really primarily there's a shift of spending from services to goods.
And one of those biggest service to good transitions, of course, is restaurants. And instead of those food dollars going to these restaurants, they instead were spent in the retail sector at grocery stores. Mark made a note of a few other retailers that saw major spikes, including home improvement DIY stores like the Lowe's and the Home Depots of the world, and one that is pretty predictable, e-commerce increased dramatically as well.
Those are 3 of the 4 largest sectors in retail. So the sectors that struggled, department stores, apparel, the ones that were forced to close their doors. Those are actually a much smaller proportion of the retail universe. So even though they struggled and were having a difficult time, it was more than made up by the phenomenal growth we were seeing in those larger sectors.
And even as spending begins to return to services like restaurants and people begin to travel again, these trends of retail sales are expected to continue. And Mark said they still feel there's enough momentum in the retail economy to get to their forecast of 6.5 to 8.2% growth in 2021. Another surprising statistic Mark mentioned, quoting a recent report by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is that the number of stores in the U.S. in the third quarter of 2020 was up 4,000 compared to the second quarter, and actually higher than where it was in the third quarter of 2019.
So, we had a lot of experts saying, we're going to see 25,000 store closures. That has absolutely not been the case. The store count at the end of Q3 2020 is higher than any Q3 number we've ever seen. So while we absolutely did see an increase in e-commerce, certainly in April and May, we were up about almost 20% of retail sales were happening in a non-store environment, but still 80% were happening in stores. That has dropped off. So in December, we were about 15.7% happening in a non-store environment. So it's been leveling off. And the important thing to remember here is that the store is still relevant because some of the fastest areas of growth in e-commerce are things like buy online, pick up in store and curbside pickup. So while a lot of retailers would consider that to be, e-commerce or digital commerce, the reality of the fact is that, the store is still part of that.
So as we see, in-person stores are still very relevant. But what does this all mean for the physical properties from a commercial real estate perspective? And what is happening on the lending side of the equation? To give insight on this, I connected with Bellwether Enterprise Executive Vice President from our Chicago office, Dan Rosenberg. For the overall landscape of the state of retail real estate, Dan described how the pandemic essentially sped up trends that were already underway. For many businesses that were already struggling, their downfall was accelerated. But there were some retail property types, echoing the trends Mark saw on the sales side, that performed well and remained resilient, particularly grocery-anchored shopping centers.
Single tenant net lease was the darling. Those performed very well. And on the sale market, the cap rates held very firm.
While there was plenty of uncertainty when the pandemic first hit, as landlords were put into precarious situations with tenants asking for rent relief, by the early summer, many retail locations began getting sorted out with either tenants vacating or agreeing to postpone rent payments or extend leases. What Dan said he's seeing now, trending and succeeding, is landlords looking to fill spaces with experiential tenants, like high-end movie theaters and unique restaurants that feature things like bowling alleys or laser tag. By creating these experience centers in and around retail tenants, visiting becomes more than simply transactional. And with these property trends, Dan envisions single-tenant net lease deals and grocery-anchored transactions leading the way. He added that he's also seeing developers and property owners knocking down large single-tenant buildings to make room for several smaller single-tenant buildings. But this all bears the question, are various retailers able to get loans in the current economic climate? Dan said the answer to that question is yes, and he envisions a lot of pent-up demand from lenders for retail properties.
Year over year, fourth quarter of 20 versus 2019, retail lending was down 72%. And for transactions that are getting done, they're generally well-located grocery-anchored assets where the grocer makes up the majority of the income and has long-term leasing available, along with long-term triple net leases. That's what's been getting done. Lenders are very focused on tenant collections, rent relief that was granted during COVID, historical sales, and utilization of the space during the pandemic. So if you were a lender and you asked that question, they would say they want to do net lease and they want to do well-located grocery anchor with long-term leases. That said, all the different lenders have very large allocations this year, and they realize that they can't hit their numbers by just doing apartment deals and industrial deals and very select retail deals. So I think as the year goes on and they have money to place, the box will expand, and we'll start to see more of the asset classes become more widely accepted. We're already seeing that. So like a Target shadow anchored center that has a couple of big box tenants, like a TJ Maxx and a Marshalls and tenants like that, now lenders will lend on those where they wouldn't 6 months ago.
If you're interested in industry news and want to sign up for the BWE Insider newsletter, please shoot us an email to marketing@bwecap.com. And for more information on what Bellwether Enterprise can do for you and your commercial real estate transaction, send us an email, give us a call, or visit our website at bellwetherenterprise.com. Thanks for listening. I'm Ryan Dentscheff, and this was Mission Control, the Bellwether Enterprise Podcast.